Good morning. My name is Kristen Schlater. I'm the Assistant Dean within the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies and responsible for the work of the Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at Rice University in Houston, Texas. We're pleased to offer this programming through Open Rice, an initiative of the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies. For more than 50 years, the Glasscock School has offered personal and professional development opportunities in a variety of subject areas, opening the gates of Rice to our community. Open Rice builds on that tradition, providing relevant and timely expertise and insight, free and online. The Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at Rice has the privilege of hosting today's session, Driving Change with Data, Key Drivers to Increase Economic Mobility in Houston, along with our partner organizations, the United Way of Greater Houston and the Greater Houston Community Foundation. The format of this webinar allows us time to learn through curated presentation, a moderated discussion with local panelists, and to respond to audience questions at the end of the session as time permits. If you do need to step away, you'll receive access to the full recording and a follow-up message. As previously noted, you can submit questions throughout the session through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will address as many of them as we can and as time permits. We trust that you will be able to utilize this information to inform yourself or support your professional work experience. Please feel free to share this with your colleagues and extended network. Today, we are fortunate to have Diana Zarzuelo as our moderator for this session. We appreciate her willingness to share her knowledge and time with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce her. She's the Vice President of Community Impact at the Greater Houston Community Foundation. She leads work in key areas of impact for the foundation, including Understanding Houston and the Greater Houston Disaster Alliance. Her educational background includes a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School. She previously led data and innovation strategies with Baker Ripley and served as a policy advisor under the Obama administration focused on economic mobility. Her professional experience currently includes working with a team that oversees grants that support economic mobility, intergenerational poverty reduction, and small business aid. These grants support hundreds of thousands across Houston and Greater Texas. Her career and her work have been rooted in equity and expanding opportunities for families and communities. We're thrilled to have her with us today, and I will now turn the session over to her to frame the session and introduce our presenters and panelists.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. I want to start off with just a very sincere thank you to each of you for joining us today. Many of you are from the nonprofit and government sort of sectors. This is a very difficult time. We're all managing and shifting through a rapidly changing landscape, and much of that is leading to real fear and anxiety and threatening some of the missions and funding and operations of many nonprofits that work to serve Houston's most vulnerable communities. So at a time of uncertain government support for low-income families and certainly very real and growing economic pressures, advancing economic mobility is more critical than ever. My hope is that this webinar offers us a chance to focus on this important issue and really arm ourselves with compelling data to tell our stories more effectively and ultimately deepen our understanding to drive progress collectively. For those of you who are less familiar with the Greater Houston Community Foundation, since its inception, the foundation has partnered with passionate donors to drive meaningful change, granting over $2.7 billion over our 30-year history. This includes nearly $260 million last year alone, primarily through donor-advised funds, with about half of that supporting our vibrant nonprofit community here in the Houston region. And as we celebrate that milestone, we are really looking to the future of philanthropy and the potential for even greater impact. Our 30th anniversary theme, Amplified Giving, is about working hand in hand with our partners and donors to spark even greater change in our communities. It signifies our commitment to adapting in an ever-changing landscape, and not just responding to challenges, but really trying to pioneer collaborative philanthropic solutions that support progress in Houston. Our Community Impact Fund is just one of the many opportunities the foundation provides its donors and partners to invest in Houston's future. Today, our community impact work is made up of 3 key pillars, and together they represent the arc we've been on over the last 5 years, really moving from data to collaborative action and impact on key issues. Built in partnership with the Kinder Institute at Rice, Understanding Houston is a regional indicators initiative that roots the foundation and our community in credible data and insight about our region's strengths and challenges. So if you haven't already, we hope that you will all visit understandinghouston.org by today or after today. Since its launch, the foundation has briefed 4,000 community leaders to help them better understand community needs, inform their philanthropy, their strategic planning, their case statements, and actions to address those needs. Back-to-back disasters in Houston, coupled with credible data about our region's climate risks, the foundation followed Understanding Houston with action, launching the Greater Houston Disaster Alliance with catalytic gifts from Enbridge and Phillips 66 in 2023. This is a philanthropic partnership with United Way of Greater Houston, city and county leaders, and more than 100 nonprofit partners, ensuring that we work together year-round to really stand ready to respond to disasters and accelerate disaster recovery. And in between disasters, pursue resources and tactics to build our resiliency. Finally, our third and newest pillar, our high-impact grant-making initiative. This initiative creates an opportunity for our donors and partners to work more deeply with the foundation to source, co-invest, and uplift the most promising solutions and approaches addressing pressing community challenges, beginning with a focus on economic mobility and intergenerational poverty. None of this work would be possible without the generous support of our donors and partners. Their contributions support the foundation's 3 community impact pillars, including the foundation's $500,000 annual grant opportunity for nonprofits and collaboratives advancing economic mobility with outsized impact. And that really brings us to today's webinar. Today, you'll hear about cutting-edge research produced by Opportunity Insights, examining economic mobility at the national, regional, and neighborhood level, as well as working to better understand the key drivers that promote upward mobility. You'll also hear from a panel of local leaders who will reflect on Houston's unique context and elevate key strategies that align with the research to improve upward mobility. You can again use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to pose questions throughout the program. And to kick us off today, we have 2 leaders from Opportunity Insights. I'll ask them to come on screen. Opportunity Insights is a Harvard-based nonprofit that conducts scientific research on how to improve economic mobility. David Forte is the Director of Research Translation and Strategic Initiatives, and Emily Leff is a Research and Data Communications Associate at Opportunity Insights. Together, they bring a rich set of experiences and expertise in research and data analysis across private, nonprofit, and public sectors. Most importantly, translating and applying insights into real-world action in areas like housing policy and homelessness, and now economic mobility. So David and Emily, welcome. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to be speaking with you all this morning about economic mobility in Houston. My name is Emily Leff, and I am a Research and Data Communications Associate at Opportunity Insights. So Opportunity Insights is a research and policy-based lab based at Harvard University. And our research focuses on identifying barriers to economic opportunity in the United States. We use a big data approach, which means our team uses large-scale administrative data sets such as census and tax records. And this allows us to study economic mobility from childhood to adulthood and better understand what factors influence upward mobility, and also how this data can inform policy decisions that promote opportunity in communities. So to give a brief overview of our presentation today, we're going to start by looking at what economic mobility means and what it looks like across the country. We'll then move on to identifying what contributes to high opportunity areas, and we'll finish up with giving examples of ways that you can explore the data in your community and some examples of communities who have implemented this data in their policy and programming initiatives. So let's start by defining what economic mobility is and how we measure it. We define economic mobility as a child's income in adulthood relative to their parents. So if a child who grows up in a low-income household, which we define as at the 25th percentile or below in the income distribution, if this child grows up and as an adult, they earn an income that's higher than that of their parents, their economic mobility would be considered upward economic mobility. And then we would consider a child who grows up to earn less than their parents in adulthood to have downward economic mobility. And using our big data approach that I referenced earlier, the way we do this is using anonymized census and tax records to identify an individual's parents' income from when they were a kid, and then tracking that and linking that to the income that that individual earns as an adult many years later. So why is economic mobility important? Economic mobility is important because upward mobility has been falling in the US since the 1940s, and we refer to this as the fading American dream. So the chance that a kid growing up today will have better economic outcomes than their parents has decreased by about 40%. So this means that while 90% of kids born in 1940 out-earned their parents, only about 50% of kids today do. So now let's look at where and for whom opportunity exists. One of the primary ways that we look at economic mobility is through the lens of geography. And so on this map here, we can see how economic mobility varies regionally across the United States. This map shows the average income in adulthood for kids who grow up with low-income parents. And so here we can see that the red regions, like some regions in the Southeast, have on average lower mobility outcomes for low-income children. And then the bluer regions, such as in some areas of the Midwest, have higher mobility outcomes for low-income kids. And while we can observe broad national patterns, we can also see the same variation within cities, neighborhood by neighborhood. So I'll point out here that the scale that we saw nationally is the same scale when we zoom into Houston. So this means that growing up in different parts of the city can result in about $20,000 to $30,000 differences in average incomes for low-income children growing up in Houston. And when we extrapolate this to total lifetime earnings, we can estimate that on average, a low-income child who grows up in a higher opportunity area can see about $200,000 more in lifetime earnings than their counterparts who grew up in similarly resourced households, but located in lower opportunity areas. And we can see here that some of these differences can play out in directly adjacent neighborhoods, separated by a single street. So it's not so much about state level differences and policies that are shaping children's outcomes as much as it is neighborhood variations. So factors like which schools children are going to, who they're interacting with, and so on, which might lead you to think about the policies impacting mobility in a different way. And so what we want to do is offer you some explanations for the determinants of why economic mobility varies so much across areas. But we want to show one other set of descriptive data that shows how these geographic areas are changing over time. And it turns out that when you do this, it's important to disaggregate not just by class or parent income, as we have here, but also by race. I will now hand it off to my colleague David, who will dive into these differences.
Thanks so much. So to build on what Emily started us off with in terms of thinking about the geography of opportunity, this past summer, just through the gift of time, we were able to update these statistics that Emily was showing to see how opportunity is changing within places across time. So we sought out to answer two specific research questions. The first being, can opportunity change within places? And then the second, can changes occur within policy relevant time periods? So how long does it take for these changes to occur? And to do this, we looked at the outcomes of children in adulthood from two different birth cohorts. So the first is children born around 1978, essentially the same group of folks that Emily showed in those initial maps. And then we looked at a second cohort of children who were born in 1992. And nationally, we saw the greatest changes for low-income Black and white children. So I'll focus on those today, just to give you a sense of how opportunity is changing. And we can start here by looking at the outcomes for low-income white children. So this first map looks very similar to the national map that Emily showed earlier. It shows the geography of opportunity, what low-income children who are white go on to earn in adulthood. And then if we can now, just through, again, the gift of time, fast forward to the second cohort of children born in 1992. And what we can see here is really a deterioration of opportunity for low-income white children. Places of the country, like the coasts, parts of the central Midwest, that offered relatively high opportunity for low-income white children, ended up offering less in this second birth cohort. So now shifting over to the experience for low-income Black children, on this first map, we have a different color scale, which will become apparent why we did that in just a moment. But here we can see the outcomes for low-income Black children born in 1978. And fast forwarding to 1992, what we see is essentially the opposite trend. So here we see outcomes improving across the board for low-income Black children. And bringing those two back together, so looking at the experience in 1992 for both low-income Black and white children, here you can see the differences in these color scales and why they're so important. So even the places in America where low-income Black children go on to have some of the best outcomes, they're still not reaching that of their low-income white peers. So we have essentially two non-overlapping distributions here. So there still remains a quite significant gap in terms of what the low-income Black children versus low-income white children can earn in adulthood across different neighborhoods in America. And so in presenting these trends, we often have a common thought of, well, if we have these two kind of converging outcomes that are happening, maybe there's some trade-offs that are happening. Maybe this is somewhat of a zero-sum game. And so to show how and explore that a bit more, we can plot these two outcomes against each other. So the change in economic mobility for low-income white children across the x-axis, and the change for low-income Black children across the y-axis. And what we can see here is a positive relationship. So the places where Black children saw the greatest improvements in economic mobility are also places where low-income white children saw the least deterioration of their outcomes. So if it were a zero-sum game, if we were having this kind of trade-off scenario, this line would be downward sloping, which is not what we're seeing in the data itself. And so we focused, at least on these maps, on the experience of low-income white and Black children, but we can also understand the outcomes for different race groups. And so in the Opportunity Atlas, you can explore this by the different categories and see how things are changing for different subpopulations within different communities. Here we're displaying the different outcomes by race for the children growing up in the Houston area. And to really make sense of these shifts, we have to think back to policies and the policy context during really the late 1990s and early 2000s that would have contributed to these trends that we're seeing today. So, our panel, I think, will speak much more to this, but really understanding the local context, the policies, the changes that were happening to really understand how these trends may have been impacted by those policies and programs. You may also be wondering how Houston fared relative to other cities across the US. So in the Opportunity Atlas, we have a ranking here that shows the changes in opportunity for the top 50, the largest 50 metro areas in the United States between these two time periods that we studied. And you can see here that Houston ranked 11th in terms of its changes. So it was the 11th most improved metro area. And that means it translates essentially into a 1.1% increase in mobility across these two time periods. And that's relative to a national average where we saw a decrease of almost 4% or so. And kind of translating that again into dollar values, that equates to about a $350 increase in annual income for those low-income children in adulthood. So in terms of how this feels, the experience of that change, it is an improvement, but it's a modest improvement. So the impact of that in terms of dollar values is still something that folks probably aren't feeling tremendously. But we do see Houston as an improving metro area amongst the top 50 in the United States. Okay, so shifting back to the map that Emily showed previously of Houston, showing the variation in opportunity, I really want to dig into now what are the characteristics of these higher opportunity areas that we see in these maps. What makes blue areas higher opportunity? And it turns out these are the 4 strongest correlates with higher opportunity areas. The first is lower poverty rates. So lower poverty concentration within a community tends to matter quite a bit. The second is more stable family structures. So the increased presence of 2-parent households within a community tends to matter. Not so much that a child grows up in a 2-parent household, but that the broader community they're exposed to has higher rates of 2-parent households within it. The third being better school quality, both in terms of K-12 education, but also access to post-secondary options. And the final one, greater social capital. And we'll spend just a bit more time digging into this outcome, as we saw that it is the strongest predictor of economic mobility that we've seen in the data thus far. And we can decompose this outcome into 2 different factors. And specifically here, when we talk about social capital, we're referring to this concept of economic connectedness. And this is the extent to which high and low income folks are in the same place with one another and forming meaningful relationships. So this first half is defined as exposure. So do we have socioeconomic integration within a place? And then the second half is this concept of friending bias. So given that we have folks in the same place together from different socioeconomic backgrounds, are they forming meaningful relationships with one another, or are they kind of self-segregating into friend groups that look like them from a socioeconomic standpoint? And we can map this similar to how we looked at the geography of opportunities. So this map is the same that we looked at earlier at the county level of upward mobility in the United States. And on the right-hand side here, we have economic connectedness mapped across the United States. And you can see how strong the relationship is here, where we see higher levels of economic connectedness. We also tend to see higher levels of upward mobility for children in the United States. And this can be seen also at the local level. So here we have the 2 maps broken out for Houston. And again, you can see these similar patterns where we see higher levels of economic mobility. We also tend to see higher levels of economic connectedness. So I wanted to give you just some tools that you can use to explore this data on your own. We looked at different maps, and these are things that are publicly available that you can explore using the Opportunity Atlas, as well as the Social Capital Atlas. These are free data visualization tools that we've developed to allow you to explore this data for yourself. And as you're doing that, if you run into questions or have, thinking about how do we apply this data in our context, our team offers virtual office hours, which you can also sign up for, and we can have a discussion about the data, what you're exploring, and any questions that you might have. Okay, so now that we've looked at these maps, we've seen what the geography of opportunity looks like. We've looked at economic connectedness and these different characteristics of higher opportunity neighborhoods. I wanted to give you a sense of how folks are actually using this data and applying it in their work. So this first comes from an example from the Seattle, Washington area. So here we're looking at a map again of the Opportunity Atlas, and plotted over the top here, we have the 25 most common census tracts, or areas that house about 4,000 people or so. 25 most common tracts were voucher holders, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where they ended up living in the area. And you'll see here that the majority are in lower opportunity areas of the county. And so through this program, we partnered with the local housing authorities to see about developing just a simple set of interventions, some case management support, housing search support that could support lower income families with housing choice vouchers to access and reside in higher opportunity areas of the county that would then go on to afford their children much greater likelihoods of seeing increased earnings in adulthood themselves. So this was called the Creating Moves to Opportunity Project. It turned out to be quite successful. We saw great changes in the patterns and the behaviors of families that wanted to participate in the program. This has gone on to spur a national replication effort through HUD, the Community Choice Demonstration Project, that's happening in 8 different locations across the US right now. It's also gone on to introduce 2 different bipartisan bills in Congress that would increase the number of vouchers that families could access in the United States, as well as kind of build in these certain set of services that really seem to matter most in supporting families to move to these higher opportunity areas. So that was an example of kind of how you can move to opportunity and kind of moving to a place that offers better outcomes for your kids. The second example I want to give is thinking about how opportunity can change within places. How can you spark place-based change? So here we turn to the community of Charlotte, North Carolina. And in 2014, when we first put out our initial study about the geography of opportunity, Charlotte ranked 50th out of 50 on that list that we looked at earlier in terms of low-income children's prospects of going on to earn in adulthood. And that really animated a lot of folks in the Charlotte community and motivated them to focus on this issue. It spurred private sector investments from folks like Bank of America in the community of millions of dollars. We saw a mayor's initiative that also generated millions of dollars of investment in economic mobility initiatives. We also saw a kind of a backbone organization formed in the community and Leading on Opportunity that really is kind of organizing and coordinating these efforts regionally for their community, as well as developing measurement tools that can help all the organizations that are working towards this goal of improving opportunity really hold themselves accountable and understand the changes that are happening in real time. So example again of how we motivate kind of place-based change within a community. And then the final one I wanted to offer was just some examples of how we've seen different organizations approach using this data on social capital and economic connectedness. So on the left-hand side here, I have an example from Dallas, Texas of Lake Highlands High School. And it turns out that in the original construction of this high school, they had 2 different cafeterias, one that served free and reduced lunch, one that did not. And so just by design, we had students from different socioeconomic backgrounds kind of having lunch and socializing in 2 different physical spaces. So this is really an example of the built environment and how the community rethought what this school could look like. How could they create more common spaces where children from different backgrounds could interact with one another? And so they redeveloped the school, created one cafeteria, also created other kind of common spaces where students could congregate and have more opportunity to interact with one another. The second here on the right is from Atlanta, Georgia, where we're seeing an organization that's focused on soccer station, and the metro system in Atlanta, the MARTA system, partnering together to build soccer fields at the different metro stops throughout the city. And it's a small map, but if you zoom in here on the Opportunity Atlas map, you can see where those different stations are located, some being in lower, some being in higher opportunity areas of the city. And through this program, they're developing soccer leagues, soccer teams, kind of based around the location of your transit stop. And they create a tournament system across using the transit system to have these teams playing with one another at these soccer fields that are developed at the stations. And so in theory, you're bringing folks from different communities, from different backgrounds together to engage in a way that they otherwise might not have been able to. So these are just 2 examples. These are not evidence-based at this point, but I think some promising practice and ideas around how you can apply that data around economic connectedness. Okay, so to wrap up, I wanted to offer you just kind of a summary of kind of the key statistics that we saw here in this presentation and for the Houston area. So the first being that economic mobility has improved in the Houston area, specifically across those 2 time periods that we looked at, though the improvements that we saw are somewhat modest, right? It was only around $350 or so in increased earnings for low-income children between those 2 time periods. We also saw that the earnings gap for low-income Black and white children narrowed a bit during those time periods that we saw, but still significant gaps remain between what a low-income Black and low-income white child ends up earning in adulthood. Also through the maps that Emily was showing, how opportunity varies greatly within a neighborhood by neighborhood within a city. So depending on where you grow up in the city, a mile or two difference can have tremendous impacts on your earnings later on in adulthood. And then finally, that economic connectedness is really a key factor for improving upward mobility. And again, and this is the strongest predictor that our team has seen in the data thus far in terms of how we understand what economic mobility looks like within places. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Diana.
Thank you so much, David and Emily. That was a lot. So I know you spoke to key takeaways. I'm just going to capture them once more before we transition to our fabulous panel. So as a region, we should celebrate, right, that we rank 11th among 50 largest metros in economic mobility gains. Yet we heard that those gains are exceedingly modest. That's just $350 more in average annual income between two cohorts of low-income children across about 15 years. Nationwide, 37 metros have experienced declines, negative mobility, showing that Houston's high ranking is really less about exceptional progress and much more about the setbacks we've seen nationally. More importantly, the research highlighted that the geography of opportunity for low-income children is hyper-local, varying significantly across neighborhoods within the same region, with friendships, authentic relationships across socioeconomic backgrounds within those neighborhoods, and very often schools for children being one of the strongest predictors of upward mobility for low-income children. And finally, as place and race remain tightly connected, there are still no places in America where low-income Black children go on to earn more than their white counterparts from similar low-income families. So today, we're joined by a panel of exceptional local leaders who will help us further contextualize the data for Houston, and I'll invite them now to come on screen. They have relevant experience and expertise in what Opportunity Insights calls those key characteristics of high mobility neighborhoods for low-income children, revitalizing neighborhoods through holistic approaches that reduce poverty, promoting supportive early learning environments and stable family structures that set a strong foundation, improving school quality, including access to post-secondary educational opportunities, and fostering greater social capital that bridges economic divides. So with us today, we have Amanda Tim, who is currently principal and owner of Amanda Tim Consulting. She brings nearly 30 years of experience in the civic, nonprofit, and community development fields. As former executive director of Bliss Houston for 12 years, she led the shift to a comprehensive approach here locally for community development that included community engagement, financial stability, real estate strategy, housing finance, and health. She's also been a catalyst and an advocate in Houston, driving change through policy and collaboration to advance transportation access and affordable housing. We also have Dr. Keonta Moore, who has dedicated her professional life to creating strong families and resilient communities to break generational poverty, with a focus on promoting early brain health and addressing health disparities. Dr. Moore is the executive director of the Hackett Center for Mental Health and executive vice president of health equity at Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. That's a long title, Dr. Moore. Under her leadership, the Hackett Center is co-creating and scaling evidence-based, community-informed policies, programs, and practices to create transformative change in mental and relational health. Finally, Carrie Wright is CEO of Good Reason Houston, a nonprofit dedicated to improving public education in Houston through systemic change in collaboration with families, educators, policymakers, and philanthropists. Deeply committed to Good Reason's vision to make Houston the premier city for public education in the nation, Carrie brings 15 years of experience in public education, public affairs, and nonprofit leadership. Prior to Good Reason Houston, Carrie spent a decade at Teach for America, worked as press secretary for the U.S. House of Representatives, and was an elementary school teacher. So before we get going, a reminder that you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can submit your own questions to the panel. We have Chelsea Chung in the background who leads Understanding Houston at the Foundation, reading and synthesizing and lifting up a few key questions to close the panel discussion. So with that, I'm going to start. I'll start with you, Dr. Moore, and then we'll move to Carrie and Amanda. So Opportunity Insights offered a number of interesting and important insights. What is one finding that is really sticking with you, either because it has you pondering on the implications or because you see it in your work every day in Houston?
Place matters. I hate to state the obvious, but in my own work and even thinking about the relational health work and the importance of us as humans and our development, the data tell the story that relationship matters and relationship happens in place. It happens where we are. The pandemic has changed quite a bit of how we interact and how we build relationships. And I think in some contexts, like what we see with adolescents, that has actually expanded opportunities and expanded what place means for youth into the virtual space. But, families are in place, economic opportunities are in place, people live in place, they worship in place. And it's very consistent with what we know about our development and what the scientific data says, that our zip codes are more predictive of our life expectancy. So how long we live really is more related to place and our zip code. And so it says everything to me of just how important it is that we focus on place, that we invest in place, and we think about that family and community unit.
I think I'm left thinking about what is our regional friendship strategy? I think I was so struck by the use of that term friendship. I mean, it's in my mind different than the notion of interaction or proximity. Friendship alone isn't formed by just that. It's some level beyond that, right? And it's also, in the literature, the terms they used obviously were also social connection and economic connectedness, but still I think like the word friendship means something beyond those words that feel sort of clinical or something to me. So I think I'm left with more of a wondering of like, how do we think about a holistic friendship strategy across Houston? And that obviously is for our youth, but it's frankly for all ages around our community. I think from my lens, certainly working in the education space, there are ways in which the sort of structure and design of schools, how they think about attendance zones to create mixed socioeconomic environments could be a facilitator of friendships. I think about even intra-school approaches and strategies. Typically we still see too much bifurcation through the form of academic tracking, where kids from high income, even in the same school, are sort of isolated from kids from low income communities and vice versa because they're in different sort of academic tracks. But I also just think about the whole universe of out of school, non-structure based activities and organizations that exist in Houston. And I'm left wondering, like, how do we cultivate Houston as a city of friendship? And how do we create a different sort of way of approaching that with our youth at the very beginning? So I think it builds on the idea of obviously place matters, but I'm just left thinking specifically about all that goes into forming and maintaining friendships.
Yeah, ditto on all of that. What struck me was that Houston has been booming during the past several decades, especially relative to other places in the country. So why is it that kids are only making really $1 more per day than their parents were with all these opportunities and with our local economy booming? So that makes me very curious. And when we look at the data, we look at the maps, social segregation is high in Houston. Are those two connected? And I love, Carrie, you talk about the friendship strategy. So then we also have to ask, well, how do people move between places to get to other opportunities, to get to other friendships? So we should look at our transportation. How can we make it easier for people to move around our city, especially if you don't have a car? To own a car costs about $12,000 per year. if you're making minimum wage or working two minimum wage jobs, that may not be an expense that you can make. So how can you spend a tiny fraction of that on public transit to get to friends and opportunity? And so I wonder about how can we make the systems work better for Houstonians so that we can gain faster in a way that matches the way our economy's been growing and the way Houston has been booming. So I think those are really key pieces for the work for me.
Great. Thank you all for those reflections. And it's a perfect segue, Amanda, to our next question. So you're right. We heard that Houston's ranking compared to 50 major metros was positive, right? We rank 11th in terms of economic mobility gains. Very, very modest. But those improvements were influenced by what took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. So during this period, what is one sort of key factor in sort of your areas of domain, a policy, a major change in practice, a cultural or demographic shift that likely contributed to this improvement, and why? So, Carrie, do you want to start us off?
Love to. Yeah. I mean, I think about it obviously again through the lens of public education. And I think in many ways, the story of public education reform in the late 90s, early aughts goes right through Houston. And I think of that in two ways. One, it was here in Houston that the birth of the modern academic accountability system sort of came to be through Dr. Rod Page's leadership in HISD, a system that serves about 250,000 students across almost 300 campuses. And really the idea was we should lead our public systems by setting really high academic standards that should be expected for every child in every community in our neighborhood. And then we need to create the systems to effectively assess how well schools are supporting students to meet those learning standards. And obviously the goal of then having that data is then to influence and encourage policymakers to then make adequate investments financially and through talent and other things to help meet the disparate needs of kids that have many unmet learning needs to make sure they're getting the resources and investments they deserve. This obviously started here in Houston, then moved up to the federal level, became what was known as No Child Left Behind, and really started a whole sort of national movement around academic accountability. And I'd say the second big thing is also the rise of high quality public charter schools also started here in Houston. Think about organizations like KIPP, Yes Prep, and even the emergence of an organization like Harmony Public Schools. Today, public charters serve about 10% of the school-age population in Houston. And I think in addition to a real focus on academic excellence, one thing that I think we could really look at from that sector is really also an obsession about a college-going or post-secondary success-oriented mindset of how do we ensure that at every stage of our educational system, we're trying to create a culture and a system of support that ensures that kids from every type of economic background is being put on a path to those post-secondary opportunities. And I think certainly a lot of that you still see true in those organizations today. And I think it also has sort of expanded out into an influence that's now affected all of our public education institutions, whether they're charter or traditional public school systems as well.
Great. Thank you. Amanda, how about you?
Just get off my mic, I could share some thoughts. So that time frame actually coincides with really Houston joining the rest of the country in its community development work. My whole career has been in community development, and the Local Initiative Support Corporation office was started in 1989. So really picking up steam in the 90s. With that, we saw more community development corporations form, and those organizations, those nonprofits are really focused on place and places where we live. So making sure that there are housing options for people of all incomes. And LISC's role is really as kind of a combination bank, consulting firm, foundation rolled up into one. So it was able to support a lot of community development organizations to develop more housing, to think about what needs to happen in those places. In the 2000s, we all kind of realized you can't help neighborhoods build their way out of poverty. You need to think about people in the place. It's logical, but we all woke up, and it really, we started to see more cross-sector collaborations, more looking at the systems of how things fit together, because it's really how people live their lives. So people live in a place, and if you have stable housing, if your kids are well taken care of well taken care of, you can go to work and you can concentrate on work and you can earn more money over time. You can build that, kind of training credentials and things like that so you can do better. If your health is good, you can live your life well. Your kids can perform well in school. You can do well at work. So if there are any factors that are affecting that, it makes it really hard. And so community development, paying attention to that and smoothing the paths and making it easy for folks is really important. And that's where we started also more of the place-based comprehensive community development work. We also saw at the same time it happening from other sectors. So really kind of the social determinants of health started being talked about more, education, kind of taking a holistic approach and realizing that those things are connected. So that was really a big shift we saw at that time.
And, I just want to add, and this will probably be a recurring theme to my comments, that we really have to focus on the why. I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about data and numbers and all these things, we lose a sense of the why. And we are human beings, and the things that you are seeing, our ability to do well in school, our ability to be healthy, a variety of different things, have economic mobility, all of the things that we all think are the aspiration of the American dream. It all requires us as humans to have that capacity. And so what we're talking about is, how do we build a society that gives human beings a capacity to be the best version of themselves and to attain, whatever those dreams or aspirations can be. So with that being said, during that time, there were a variety of different factors, because the complexity of the human experience, right, is really at play here. And so, housing policy, education policy, in the late 90s, Texas, supported early, pre-K enrollment. And we know that early pre-K has very strong outcomes for not just high school graduation and college attainment, but also later life, better relationships, better marriages, things that we talk about. But why? And it's really because these experiences really shape the development of who we are as people and the capacity of us to take advantage of opportunities that exist. So yes, we absolutely need policies and programs and economic investments to create those opportunities. But as we're thinking about and imagining together what Houston could look like, the design of it has to keep the humanness, the person-centeredness at the center of it and at the heart of it, so that we can get this right. So I kind of answered more than your question, but
Yeah, no, it was great. Great, thank you. Amanda, I want to go back to you. You started on a really great path around community development and really talking about the history there. So as we're hearing, opportunity really varies by place, super hyper local. And there are a variety of models for neighborhood revitalization. Harlem Children's Zone, purpose-built communities, Lisco neighborhoods, complete communities here in Houston. So can you delve just a little bit more deeply into this work? Because I don't think everybody is super familiar. And tell us what the best practices are, but then where do you hope it goes next in Houston?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. So I think it's important to realize that in community development and in many of the work, the different fields of work that we do now, focus on investment and outcomes matters. So instead of the charity mindset of, let's just serve people, count how many we serve, let's really invest and realize that we are our best assets. And how do we develop ourselves as assets, ourselves and our neighbors, as well as help individuals earn assets and develop assets that financially are going to help them be successful. So the models that you mentioned have a few things in common, and it's investment, focusing on outcomes, collaboration, cross-sector collaboration. So really helping the folks with the resources, the foundations, the corporations, the government, work closely with the folks living in the communities and working on those front lines, the community-based organizations, the nonprofits, and coordinating efforts to figure out what's working well and how to make it work better, and what's not working, and to close those gaps. And so that really requires a few things. One is to set a common agenda to make sure everybody has the same game plan. We're looking at the data, using the data, but most importantly, using the data of the lived experience of the people who are there. How does this work and feel for them? What's happening? What are those nuances that we may not know as outsiders? And then encouraging folks who live in the communities and work in the communities to be part of the decisions about directing resources and making those changes. Also keeping in mind policy. So common agenda, watching the data, continuous communication, collaboration, community leadership, and then really the relationships piece is huge. Progress moves at the speed of trust. And so people getting to know each other, understand what each person brings, experiences, and trusting each other to do the work together matters significantly. I think it's important to also just flag that these cross-sector partnerships help us realize the shortfalls and the strengths, and making sure that our activities are reinforcing each other. And that another key piece is having a strong backbone organization, somebody who is on the ground in the neighborhood, coordinating the work, monitoring the data and the progress, helping to kind of keep all the trains running on time, and making sure that folks are stepping in and using what they have. Where I hope it's going is more collaboration and really a focus on policy, but using the relationships that we're building across sectors to advocate together. A lot of the folks coming to the table in these collaborations have access and have power. If they are advocating for neighborhoods, that could be hugely impactful. So one of the things that I'm working on right now is the Houston Economic Growth Collaborative, which is really focused on economic mobility by bringing together corporations, foundations, nonprofits, and working in a place, a cluster of neighborhoods, and listening to those folks, what are their plans, and being their partners. The thing that has been done in most of these instances, the different work that I've been part of and the models you've mentioned, is that there's someone leading it and they're having to raise resources, and that's a really big part of the work. If these groups can come together on the front end, the ones with resources, and aggregate them and offer them to take that burden off the folks on the front lines in communities, that could make a big difference. In addition to that, if they're advocating, that can make a big difference. I think it's the relationships and the understanding among the partners at the table that help us have those light bulb moments and find solutions. I think also a key piece is, what are the resources beyond financial resources that we can offer so that people can get jobs? We can have corporations look to hire people from the places that we're focusing on. We can also make sure products and services are designed to really serve those communities well and meet them with their needs where they are, to make things easier, just smooth those paths.
Great. Thank you. Carrie, I'm going to turn it to you. And the Opportunity Insights research reminded us of another really rigorous sort of research project out of Stanford that touched on similar themes. They analyzed more than 430 million student test scores across 4,000 school districts over 10 years. And they found that the racial concentration of poverty in schools is one of the strongest predictors of academic achievement gaps. And then we've also heard from Kinder Institute and others about how much more expensive really it is to serve a low-income student in a high poverty school compared to a more mixed income school. So how are you all thinking about this challenge? What are the system level changes that are really needed to ensure that every student, regardless of zip code, really has access to high quality education?
Okay, big question. I've got 5 parts to my answer. I'm going to go quick.
5 parts, 4 minutes, go.
Yeah. So one, I'll build on a point that Dr. Moore made earlier. So I think the first thing is we need to have an obsessive focus on early education, and we need to ensure that those quality early learning options are available, accessible, and utilized by everyone across our community. There's a couple parts of quality early education. One is obviously getting more kids in quality early childcare. There's nearly 3,000 childcare centers across Harris County, so that's not a small task to figure out how to help support those systems to improve the quality of what they provide to students. The second is getting more kids enrolled into quality pre-K. Across our region, only 41% of eligible 3- and 4-year-olds are enrolled in district-run pre-K, and we need to see that number move because we know it predicts so many other lifelong outcomes later on. And then I think we also have to be obsessed with the early grades. So kinder, first, and second. Our state right now doesn't have a system to measure how well kids are doing in first and second grade. And what happens is we don't actually get insight into student learning until 3rd grade. And right now across our region, only 36% of our students are meeting both math and reading standard by 3rd grade. We need to address that early so that those gaps don't widen and grow over time. Second big thing is we really need to work on moving from a system designed around neighborhood wealth to a system that makes excellence accessible for all. And what I mean by that is, for instance, we need to really look at how to re-engineer the teacher talent economy in education. Right now, a lot of teachers end up working at schools that typically serve communities with high neighborhood wealth. We actually need to create incentives and structures to target effective teachers to go work on campuses where students have the greatest number of unmet learning needs. And so I think that would be one way that we could help redesign a system that today is still designed around neighborhood wealth and really move it in the direction of making excellence available to all. I think the third big thing we need to think about is prioritizing limited resources around investments where they're needed most. Right now, the standard ratio of students to advisors, college counseling advisors, is about 500 to 1. That does not work for first generation newcomer families and students who need a lot of added coaching, support, and advising to help them think about navigating choices as it relates to post-secondary education opportunities, career, and otherwise. So I think we need to really examine how can we come up with incentives, with financial outcomes, bonus funds, and other things that really help us address this issue of advising in a more student-focused way. And then finally, I think we need to look at strategies that structurally encourage socioeconomic integration. So obviously that's everything from what we have in our backyard, magnet programs, open enrollment, and intra-district choice that give families options to choose quality school models that matter to them and their student. Other examples are thoughtful definitions around how we build enrollment and attendance boundaries that make sure we have mixed student groups in schools. And then increasingly what we're seeing around the country is also models of what is referred to as pairing, where 2 campuses that are somewhat close by, but serve completely different economically situated populations begin to sort of operate more as a contiguous unit where students are shared across those campuses to create that type of mixed income environment that could lend itself to stronger economic connectedness, social connection, and friendship. So a lot that needs to go in that space, but for sure things we're thinking about and seeing evidence of around Houston.
Thanks so much. Dr. Moore, we're going to open it up shortly to questions from the audience. So thank you for those who have put those questions in. Before we do, Dr. Moore, I'm gonna ask you a final question. So the Opportunity Insights research really highlighted a strong correlation between economic mobility and sort of those community level employment rates, which they describe as sort of a proxy for well-being at the community level, and how critically important that community well-being is to upward mobility. So what are some of the things that you've seen through your research and experience, and how can policies and programs be designed to support entire families and communities to foster that upward mobility?
On every possible outcome, the data demonstrates that when you look at the family unit and you support the family unit, you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck, so to speak. So when you look at mental health outcomes and things, mental and mood disorders and adolescents, when you support the family unit and the parents in supporting that child has better outcomes. When you think back to my earlier statement about the why, the brain is developed at an exceeding rate during the first couple years of life. And that's the reason why quality childcare and parenting support, treating postpartum depression early on and taking advantage to support that even two-generation approach between the parent and the child is so critical, because our human development is most fragile at that period of time. And so the idea that relationships is the strongest predictor of economic mobility is not surprising, because the science supports that from the time that we were born, that these relationships actually in our experiences actually shape the neuronal connections and how our brain is formed, and that increase our cognitive ability, our ability for self-regulation and behavior, our motivation, our ambition, all of the things, our mental health, our emotional well-being. And so in community, families find support. And so my research in Third Ward really took a look at that and found that we used a measure which was a little bit different than the measure that was used today, but we called it collective efficacy. And it was similar in that it was a proxy of social connectedness that was based in trust. And so instead of friendships, but you imagine, Carrie, to your point, like, what are the ingredients of friendship? Well, trust is an important ingredient of friendship. And so we measured that level of trust and found that despite extreme poverty, the folks made $10,000 or less a year, they were having better outcomes. So lower rates of anxiety and depression, more physical activity than expected, and even a drive and ambition to really, have increased economic opportunity. And so when the Kinders and other folks made investments, the community was right to take advantage of that. And so Annie Casey has also done some studies on, like this place-based financial investment and deciding how communities are ready. And one of that readiness indicator is this connectedness. And so I would say it's all about relationships. The last thing I'll say, and I just want to highlight from the data, is that, sometimes, and we've seen this here in Houston, when low income housing is being proposed to move into a high income neighborhood, the folks who've worked really hard to live in those neighborhoods and pay quite a bit of money, might have mixed emotions about that experience, because there's an underlying fear that somehow the needs of these low income children will be so great, they might take away from our children. But I think what the data presented today and other research I've shown is actually that's not true. That those of us who live in high income neighborhoods, actually our children benefit from being around children of lower income neighborhoods. And there's data to show it makes our children more compassionate, more sensitive, more aware, have deeper levels of gratitude, which is shown to lead to overall wealth and happiness and well-being. So, I just want to say that there's nothing about today that was surprising. I think I'm interested to hear about what we're going to do next.
Great. Yes, just building on that point, there is clear research that we all benefit from integrated schools in particular, prepares us for the workforce, particularly in Houston, where we are one of the most diverse cities in the country. So thank you for that. I'm going to move to some of the questions from our audience. So Carrie, this one is for you. How much advocacy do you think really needs to happen at the state level versus the county or local level? And they touch on particularly education funding and how that seems to be just stagnating or reducing relative to need and inflation and those sorts of things.
I think the state is definitely an opportunity for focus. Obviously, a lot of decisions about education policy in our state, decisions around funding, all emanate from state level decisions by our state legislature. So I definitely say the state is an area for focus. I think there are obviously many ways to go about exploring more funding for public education. One is through the form of a general increase to what is known as the basic allotment. So just generally, how much money do schools receive per student based on their enrollment and attendance? The second are thinking about allotments of funding that really target specific outcomes or interventions in our public school system. So one of the allotments that our organization's focused on this legislative session is trying to increase the early childhood allotment, which would send more funding to school districts specifically to help them expand access and availability to high quality pre-K3 and pre-K4 programs that are free to eligible residents in Houston and Harris County. So again, so I think state's the focus. But as we look at the question of education funding, I think there's the overall, how can we increase more in our education funding? But there's also ways we could be a lot more strategic and targeted in terms of what type of investments do we want to make to effectuate which types of outcomes for which types of students, I think is also a way to be thinking about the funding question in public education.
Mm-hmm. Great. Amanda, there's a question here. There's quite a bit of context, but I'm going to just try to pick up the key point, which is just how historically marginalized neighborhoods and communities find it very hard to trust and build those cross-sector collaborations and relationships to build a common agenda and work together and aggregate resources. And so how do you navigate that? How do you think about that? What do you think are sort of ingredients to build some of that trust, given the context of what maybe you've seen here in Houston happen?
Yeah. So I'm just going to speak in very tactical terms. Part of it is show up and keep showing up, even when you're being tested. So a lot of marginalized neighborhoods have been let down and shut out of resources over and over and over. After a disaster, people come out and do plans, nothing happens from their perspective. So it's show up, take the heat, and then deliver. So if there is a plan, make sure things are getting done on that plan, from a public sector perspective or any of the other partners, and make sure people are aware of it so they can see what's happening and take advantage of the new resources. And then I think it's also show up with resources right away, like start the investment right away and start small. And if you're engaging folks in that process and using that as a way to bring people together and support them getting to know each other and folks who may be from the outside, those relationships matter and the information sharing matters, and it makes the results stick and people can see their own power in the process. I think it's about helping neighborhoods understand and support their use of power, and that will help build a lot of trust.
Can I add to that, Diana?
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think it's really important that we understand that we should stop designing systems without including the people those systems are designed for, right? I think, again, kind of my bias is in healthcare, but thinking about our healthcare system, I'm not sure who the healthcare system was designed for, but it certainly wasn't designed for the patients, okay? And it absolutely was not designed for women. So, we have these systems that we keep pouring money into and we keep making investments in, and the systems aren't working for the people that we're intending these systems to work for. So I think part of the legitimate mistrust is that there's a lot of money that people are pouring into solutions, yet the folks who are supposed to reap the benefit of those investments aren't. And so I think there's a frustration on both ends, probably on the folks making the investment or supporting the policy for the change to happen, or feeling frustrated that we've only had a 1% increase, right? And those whose lives that those dollars were intended to impact are also very frustrated. And I think the root cause of that is we really have to start communicating and designing and reimagining. And I think honestly, where we are now in this country is an opportunity where folks are rethinking things. And so I think Houston has an opportunity to reimagine how we're doing our business and how we want our city to look like in 10, 20, 50 years.
By 2036, maybe we'll be celebrating 200th birthday for Houston. There's a lot that can happen in 11 years. Carrie, there's another question for you here around post-secondary opportunities, and you touched on that and how sort of the college for all sort of movement helped people aspire, but then how that's broadening and thinking about different kinds of pathways that really lead to careers and jobs that have living wages that create upward mobility. What successful models or programs or approaches are you seeing that give you either hope here in Houston if they're local or nationally that you would be excited about?
A recent example that I think is just starting to get off the ground that I'm looking at with a lot of intrigue up in Dallas County. They have embarked on a process to essentially create an independent nonprofit entity to manage all of student advising for the public school systems across Dallas County, really addressing this key issue that we don't have enough sort of focus in terms of people power behind advising our students that are most at risk from not enrolling in quality post-secondary options, not persisting through them, not completing them, and then not being on a path to a high wage, high demand job that could help them earn a living wage. So I think there's a lot of interest around like what shape that could take over time because of new public funding structures in Texas. So thinking specifically about something that came about through what is referred to as HB3 a couple legislative sessions ago. Districts now get additional dollars for long-term sort of post-secondary outcomes of their students. And they can use that money then to basically start to fund stronger advising supports to get more kids to and through those quality post-secondary options. So I'm really interested in, again, kind of building on Dr. Moore's point in this context, like how do we approach some of these questions through a different strategy around like how we structure supports around students in our school systems? There's one way to solve this, which is we've had sort of this bifurcated system of there's K-12, there's higher ed, there's workforce development. But it's like, what if we looked at a world where like these are all become more blended and we don't have the same sort of fixed lines around these boxes? And in a way, like that would be the coordinated system of care, so to speak, to use that term from a different sector that like would most benefit our students, right? But to say that is maybe a revolutionary statement, obviously, because it would require changing a lot of things as they are today. So anyway, I think I'm just looking at places around the country where they're looking to address some of these questions through different structure, different strategy, different approaches, and really thinking about how those could be applied to our population here in Houston.
Great, thank you. There's a question for anyone who wants to take it. It's sort of a big question. In the rankings, why do you think Houston actually lags other Texas cities like Dallas, Austin, San Antonio in those sort of economic mobility? Brownsville, I think, was in there in those economic mobility gains, knowing that they were really modest to begin with, but we saw several Texas cities at the top of that list. But Houston was on the sort of, behind some of the other peers. Any thoughts or ponderings about why that might be?
First, I'm very curious about disasters and its impact on us and our ability to do better. We know in disasters, whether it's a flood, a hurricane, some sort of economic disaster, COVID, the marginalized communities are hit harder and it's harder to recover. And so that has kind of a domino effect. So I that would be one of my guesses and something to look into.
My initial thought was that those cities are smaller, and so there's probably a lot more opportunity for folks of different backgrounds and different economic opportunities to come cross each other's path. I mean, we are a massive entity, and it's really even hard to get around Houston without a car or vehicle. And so I think in the smaller, I mean, not that they're small towns by any means, right? But just relative, San Antonio compared to Houston or Austin compared to Houston, they are much smaller cities where I think there's probably a lot more opportunities for folks to interact and develop this social connectedness, is a guess.
Carrie, anything to add? If not, there's actually a couple of other questions that we can try to get to.
Move on. I'd just be
Yeah.
adding conjecture
Okay.
to the, so I don't know that.
Okay. So given that social capital and economic connectedness, Dr. Moore, to your point that you just left, was such a driver of upward mobility, does anyone know of effective initiatives that actually increase that sort of connectedness? And to your point, Houston is huge and sprawling. So just any thoughts about what that might look like? Or Carrie, you talked about the regional sort of, friendship strategy. What have you seen that has actually worked, if anything, related to that?
So it comes out of like grassroots movement, but when I was doing my research in Third Ward, and I did another project in Sunnyside around this measure of collective efficacy, which is again a measure just of trust and the willingness to act on another's behalf. What came out of that, one of the mentors that I had, he started his research back during the civil rights movement, and then continued it throughout the course of his career. But what he found is that if folks have a common cause, a common issue, then folks of different races, religions, economic backgrounds will find a place to come together and form this mutual trust. And that trust leads to the willingness to defend each other, protect each other, look out for each other, which again are all characteristics of what one would say is friendship. And so I think, the more that our city can have opportunities for people to get involved at all levels. Often we limit our involvement to certain sectors, right, or certain people. But, and that's why when we go to these meetings, we see the same people every time, because it's just sort of us all trying to do what we can to roll up our sleeves and make Houston a better place to live. But I think if we opened up those opportunities, for everyday people to sort of get involved and find things that they're passionate about. Similarly in Minnesota, they did kind of a parent mobilization and found this connectedness amongst different groups of people when it came to making the school better for their children. So I think we have lots of causes, that we can mobilize and get energy around. And it's just like, how do we get people engaged and involved around things that they're passionate about, I think is a great opportunity.
Yeah, I love that. I can speak to a specific example in the Go Neighborhoods work during my time at LISC, where designed into kind of the effort was starting with 100 one-on-one conversations where folks in the neighborhood were tasked with going out and meeting people they didn't know and sitting down and finding out what are each other's dreams, what do they love about the community, what are they involved in. And that, exactly as Dr. Moore said, found those common elements. In addition to that, they built a relationship, and it's easier and more fun to go to a meeting when you know you're going to see friends there, and it's not scary because you won't know anyone and you have that shared history. So then you can expedite the conversations because there's already some trust and relationships that are interweaving with each other. You're kind of reweaving the social fabric in your neighborhood. And then you can talk about what are our shared dreams? What are we going to take action on? So when someone calls and says, we really need to do something about what's happening at the school, at the whatever, they know each other. Shortcut, let's get into action. Let's do this because we care about each other. And so I think we saw that play out. And people were leading their own efforts in their neighborhood and being supported to do so. So I think sometimes it just takes that practice and building a culture of relationships, and then going from there, relationships and collective work.
I feel like I'm
If
now.
I can also, can I add one thing? In that neighborhood in particular, there were a mix of incomes. And
I
so
would just
people
say
were,
that it
yeah.
didn't- yeah.
So the northern part of the neighborhood was more middle upper income. And then the southern part of the neighborhood was more recent immigrants that were kind of getting their feet under them. They were finding ways to interact with each other. And so that shared experience and shared opportunity, they took care of each other.
I think, in the realm of organizations that exist to help promote connectivity and social capital that help students advance towards high potential post-secondary options, I think of organizations like Emerge or
Yeah.
Bridge here locally in Houston that really use a relational model to make sure that kids get guidance on the choices they have in front of them, and that they also get that sort of personalized support to navigate those options and persist through them. I'm also now like coming full circle to where I started with this curiosity around friendship. And I'm just like actually sort of like ruminating right now on this idea that we also have this convergence of a like a decline in social connection across our country post-pandemic and with the advent of social media and all these things. And I'm like thinking about the body of work that Jonathan Haidt has done around the anxiety generation, or Robert Putnam's like famous work. And I guess it's kind of making me think about the critical role of organizations too that really do exist for the sake of fostering relational connections beyond those, faith-based communities, but even organizations like Big Brothers, Big Sisters that are thinking about how to really create those like cross connections by generation, by income level, and otherwise. So, but the question for me with these great organizations doing work is also then how do we think about scaling that work to a region the size of Houston and the vastness that is like our great community. So I think that's kind of the ever-present wondering of how do we take greatness and make it accessible to more?
Yeah. Related to that, I'm gonna close, Amanda. I think this is more in your realm, and then we'll go to our closing question. But someone's asking essentially, so place-based strategies, community development that bring it all together, make it hyper local, build relationships across sort of income and opportunity sets. Seems like a great sort of approach. And yet, how do we do that while minimizing displacement and pushing low income families who have historically, resided in neighborhoods and built some wealth through home ownership in some cases? How do we minimize that sort of massive issue?
Policy, a comprehensive housing plan would help, and directing our resources and setting policies that balance that redevelopment. It's when the redevelopment happens too fast that gentrification and displacement is a great risk. So when you can invest in an equitable redevelopment, again, where folks who are in the neighborhood are involved, and we're deploying our public resources as well as kind of creating structures that support folks to stay and balance that redevelopment, it can prevent displacement. The other thing is, helping folks who are there to earn more income, so that also can be a balancing factor. So I think there are a number of strategies that have been articulated, and I think policy is the biggest one.
Great. So we're going to close. And I often like to say that if there is any place across the country that Houston is the place where we can preserve the American dream, I really believe that. I think we have a lot of the great ingredients. I think the data supports that. We aren't seeing declining mobility. So what are your final thoughts on that? What do we need to do in Houston to continue to advance economic mobility? What might we need to do differently to make and sustain real progress?
I'll go first. I think part of it is a mindset shift that, moving to yes, in my backyard, let these things happen in my neighborhood. All kids are our kids. That mindset would make a big difference. And then with that, closing the gaps. So for instance, I'm going to throw out a lot of terms, without description, but the benefits cliff, making sure that eligibility and income growth do not contradict each other and leave folks without supports. Disaster preparedness. $1 spent in disaster preparedness can save $7 in disaster recovery. Like, let's think long term and invest in small ways now so that we don't pay multiple times what the cost of solving a problem is later. And again, if these kids are our kids, and if the moral imperative doesn't kind of inspire you, then poverty is expensive. And I just talked about these examples. It's really expensive to solve a problem if you could have prevented it. So I think we need to have a longer term outlook as we design what happens in our city and engage and just make those systems be more seamless and work better.
Go off of Amanda. These are our kids. So in the two examples in that, he presented the Charlotte example, and then there's an example in Minneapolis. The thing that sparked change was an outrage that children were not doing well. In Minneapolis, I went up there, I talked to the leaders, the business community who really made significant investments that really transformed opportunities for children in their city. And it started with a report that showed that like kindergarten readiness was like 70% below the national average, particularly for low-income children. And that's when community leaders got together, business leaders got together, philanthropy got together, the schools got together, and it was a rallying cry because they were like, these are our children. This is our city. And I think Houston, for all of its diversity, there is quite a bit of segregation, and there is quite a bit of a mindset of us versus them, instead of an embodiment of this is us, that we are Houstonians. And after disasters, you see evidence that it exists within each of us, because after disaster, it's us in Houston strong, and we're rallying together. But then somehow we have short memories, and it all comes to an end. So that would be my one thing that should happen.
I think I just build on kind of the idea I touched on earlier, which is just like really being willing to blur the lines of the traditional boundaries that exist. And how do we think about striving to build and further strengthen this coordinated system of care for our region's kids that goes from cradle to career, or kind of wherever you want to set those benchmarks, but that we're really working collectively as a region, informed by both data and also community voice and perspective, but looking holistically at like, are our systems working consistently well together to support more kids to be on a path to better opportunity? And I think we have to ask those types of questions to the big sets of data, but we also have to ask those questions to the communities themselves that are relying on a lot of our public entities in particular to provide them and their children with the better leg up in life. So I think for me, it's kind of this idea of how do we keep striving to build that connectivity across that whole continuum of care that's supporting in my case, the educational success of students, but obviously more broadly than that, just their like life opportunities and life prospects, and making sure they're more mobile than their parents. So.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We are wrapping up. Clearly, the story of economic mobility in Houston is more nuanced than we can cover in a 90-minute webinar. But the data in today's conversation really tells us two things. First, that there are great strengths in Houston worth celebrating and building upon. And second, that there's still a great deal of work to ensure that every Houstonian, every child that grows up here has a real chance to climb the economic ladder. We hope that this data inspires all of us as a call to action. By better understanding what supports upward mobility, we can scale effective strategies and address persistent disparities. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Open Rice, Kristen and Leslie, for your support. A big thank you to our speakers for the thoughtful and stimulating discussion. We will share the slide deck, and we have linked just a few opportunities for further engagement. I'll call out 3 very quickly. So visit Understanding Houston, Reach out if you want a presentation for your audience to inform an action and a strategy, whatever you're moving forward. Dig into Opportunity Atlas and the Social Capital Atlas, and don't hesitate to use the office hours to get help or ask a question. Super friendly team at Opportunity Insights. And then if you are a nonprofit or a collaborative of nonprofits and other organizations working to advance economic mobility in Houston, we hope that you'll stay tuned by signing up for our newsletter, following us on social media to learn more about the $500,000 grant opportunity that will open by early May. So with that, thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you, Diana, and panelists and our presenters. As we come to the end of our time together, we also want to thank our full team and partner entities, the Greater Houston Community Foundation, United Way of Greater Houston, and the Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at Rice University. We appreciate the information that was provided today and trust that all of our attendees will be able to put it to good use. As a reminder, this session was recorded and all registered participants will receive a link in a follow-up message to the recording. It will also remain on the Open Rice website for on-demand viewing for those people who might be interested but have not registered for this session in advance. Additionally, you'll receive a brief email regarding upcoming Open Rice sessions for your consideration, and we'll hope you continue to engage with us through Open Rice and invite others to join. If you're interested in opportunities to continue your professional development with Rice, please visit continue.rice.edu. Again, thank you all for your time today, and please have a wonderful rest of your day.